Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Zachariah Renfro, and today we're going to be talking about addiction recovery care in the K12 environment. I've titled this talk Meaning, Madness, and Recovery, and this is a prep session for a talk that I'm going to be giving to some schools counselors pretty soon. And the goal of this is to really inform and educate the audience about topics in addiction and addiction recovery and ways that faith can fit into that, as well as to talk a little bit about my own work in addiction recovery. So I want to start this talk off with just some simple questions for you and the audience to really ponder over, to think about. What does it mean to be alive? What does that mean? Every day you wake up, you open your eyes, you see things, but what does that really mean? What does it mean to suffer and survive hardship? Suffering is one of those universals in life, like death and taxes, that will happen to you because we live in a world of entropy and decay, right? We're born into this world, and our bodies, throughout the course of our life, begin to slowly break down. We face hardships, whether man-made or natural. And what does it mean to suffer through those and then survive on the other end? What does it mean to struggle in an uncaring world? Some people, when they face struggles and hardship, do have a strong community and do have strong support to care for them and to lift them up. But a lot of people don't. It is more common, especially in today's world, for someone to struggle and find hardship and not have anyone to help them, not have anyone to lift them up. So what does that mean? And then finally, how do we cope? We found that suffering is going to be a part of our lives. We found that we may struggle alone. How do we cope? And that's going to be kind of the theme. So think about these questions as we go through the talk and see if perhaps it illuminates something to you. So these are the things we're going to cover. We're going to talk about who I am. We're going to talk about addiction as a crisis of meaning, some general facts about addiction, wellness as a theory, faith and recovery and faith's connection to wellness, Faces of Recovery, Overcoming Addiction, my book, and we'll talk a little bit about how schools can hopefully help young people deal with any addictions or struggles they may face. So a little bit about who I am. I'm a philosophy professor. I've got a PhD in business and a master's in philosophy and a bachelor's in accounting and philosophy as well, right? I'm an award-winning photographer, and I've previously managed a Suboxone clinic that had both inpatient and outpatient care. I was over a small team of people, and we worked to try and get people through this process of recovery, right? It was a tough process. We'd see people most of the time on their worst days, or coming out of jail, or they're coming to our program to avoid going into jail, and we would try and work them through that process to get them to the other side and get them into recovery. There are a lot of theories about addiction and how addiction might drive a person, and there are a lot of scientific factors that we can look to kind of point us in the way. But one that I found very convincing is that addiction in many cases can be seen as a crisis of meaning, right? So we look at the work of renowned psychologist Viktor Frankl, who himself survived concentration camps, and he describes the thing that is required for us to get through suffering and hardship is a motivation for meaning, right? Whether that's religious meaning or whether that is a belief that our suffering has a purpose, whether that is some sort of goal that we have, right? He believed that the main thing that could push us through suffering and hardship was having a reason why. He talks about that in Man's Search for Meaning, his most famous book, and his whole study of logotherapy is ensconced in that idea, right? Without meaning, he says there are really two things that happen. Either people crumble and they give up and try and retreat, or they turn to barbarism. And we'll see a little bit more of how this all connects to addiction. But just kind of keep in mind, if a person doesn't have meaning, if they don't have some motivation, what is left for them to do? If they don't have anything that's pushing them to wake up and get out of bed and do what they need to do, why are they going to do it? And instead, what else might they turn to, right? So let's talk about some general facts about addiction. And again, as I go through these, I want you to keep in mind some of the thoughts of Frankl, right? So roughly 17% of Americans of all ages struggle with either drug or alcohol addiction within the last year. Now, some of these people will find their way into recovery, some of them won't, right? So the number is going to fluctuate a little bit. And we're going to see a breakdown of that 17% into age brackets, right? 26 and older, that's the vast majority, about 37 million. 9 million, 18 to 25, and about 2 million, 12 to 17. When it comes to that risk of addiction, a big chunk of it's going to come from genetics and environment. And what does that mean? Well, this is one of those things that's hard for us to really scientifically break down, which specific thing is the thing that caused them to go into addiction. But essentially, if you're living in an environment where drug use and things of that nature are common, alcoholism, odds are you're going to fall into it too, right? That's basically what that's saying. About 1 in every 11 adolescents suffer from addiction, so that is people 12 to 17, which is a shockingly high number, right? Think about that. You go to a high school classroom. There's 30 kids, let's say 33 kids. 3 of them will, either be using alcohol or drugs to an extent where it's hindering their lives, right? Young people who try drugs before 15 are 6 times more likely to end up in addiction. And again, that makes sense. I'm in my 30s. I wouldn't know where to find drugs if I wanted to do them, right? But if you're a 15-year-old or 14-year-old and you're able to get your hands on drugs, you're already having something going wrong in life. You're already having some sort of crisis, and it is very likely that you'll end up in addiction, right? 27% of people 18 to 25 suffer from some type of addiction. So again, that's about 1 in 4. You might think, okay, well, why is it 27% of young people, but only 17% of all Americans? Well, you got to think about that number, that 1 in 11 from 12 to 17. There are kids within those 11 who probably would do drugs if they could get their hands on them, but they can't. So when they get to the age of majority, then they will start using these things, and that's going to balloon the number, right? And then as they get older, typically they'll start working into the recovery and rehab system sometime between like 27 to 40-ish, right? Somewhere in that time period is the average time period people are going to get into an addiction recovery place, and then they're going to work their way off of drugs, right? So you got this pipeline that balloons up early and then starts trickling out later in life. Let's think about some more things related to addiction. About 40 to 60 domestic abuse situations involve alcohol and drugs, and 80% of child abuse, both physical and sexual cases, involve alcohol and drugs. So again, we think back to that high proportion of young people, that high proportion of adolescents that are in addiction or at risk of getting into addiction, and we're seeing that it's almost a hereditary thing. If your parents are doing drugs, odds are you're going to fall into it. If your parents are abusive or doing things, it's probably going to cause you so much suffering and distress that you're going to want to escape that. Because think about it, for these young people, think back to Viktor Frankl. For these young people, the young child or teenage child of an addict, what is your purpose? What is your sense of meaning that's pushing you through the day? What is your higher goal that you're striving for? Who knows, right? I know when I was that age, I didn't really have some higher goal. I wasn't going through anything drug or alcohol related or any kind of abuse, but a lot of young people don't have any kind of goals or higher purpose or meaning in their life just because our society doesn't emphasize that, right? So you got these kids going through this horrible, horrible suffering, and then they're going to want to escape that. They're going to need something to guide them through that, right? So let's continue on. 41% of female and 11% of male addicts report being sexually assaulted at some point. So, if you meet a woman who's been in addiction, there's about a 50% chance that she's been sexually assaulted. About half. And if you meet a man in addiction, there's a 1 in 10 chance roughly that he's been sexually assaulted. So just think about that. These people, they're living in their early life is full of suffering. They get into drugs and alcohol. That causes a spiral of bad things, and the bad things continue to happen to them even as they're adults. And sometimes these sexual assaults happen when they're kids, right? But it keeps going throughout life, right? Between 50 and 80% of prisoners in jails have addiction issues, and 26% of people, about 1 in 4, who commit violent crimes have had some sort of addiction. So again, we're seeing this picture, right? We've got this huge jail population that is in addiction, and then we've got about 1 in 4 people committing violent crimes who are in addiction. Am I saying that if the people committing violent crimes weren't in addiction that they wouldn't commit violent crimes? I don't know. Maybe. There's a strong chance that they wouldn't, but it's hard to say. And here's the most difficult statistic. About 80% of juvenile offenders were active drug and alcohol users, right? So keep that in mind. If you walk into a juvenile hall and you see 10 kids there, 80% of them were actively using alcohol and drugs. The other 2 who weren't using alcohol and drugs probably, had severe mental health issues, right? So that's kind of the picture we're painting. We've got these young people with no meaning or motivation in their life. We have abusive situations. We've got drugs and alcohol tearing families apart. And it's creating adults and teenagers who are falling into the cycle, right? So we're going to have a little bit of change of gears. And for many of you, this is going to seem like a refresher, right? This is Swabrick's 8 Dimensions of Wellness, and it's one of the more popular kind of metrics for defining wellness in modern times. Is it the only one? No. Are there other ones? Yes, there's some competing ones, but we're going to look at Swabrick because it's one that most people who have taken, say, a psychology class will have heard of. It's got these 8 dimensions: occupational, social, emotional, spiritual, intellectual, physical, environmental, and financial. And these are pretty straightforward. Each of these areas influences the others. And a person who is healthy in all of these areas will have a very high wellness score. They're going to have a very healthy, good life, right? When someone falls into addiction, it touches every single one of these. It supervenes on them, and it will destroy their wellness. Say they had a very good physical health before, maybe they worked out a lot, addiction will take that from them. Say they had a good job, addiction will take it from them. Financial security, addiction's going to take it from them, right? So every single one of these areas, addiction is going to touch on, and it's going to take. Social health, right? You're going to lose a lot of friends when you start using drugs. Emotional health, it's going to take you into some dark places. Spiritual health, it's going to be hard for you to find this meaning and this connection to something greater when you have this tug of addiction pulling you on the inside. Intellectual health. Well, when was the last time you tried to, say, study for a test while you were, I don't know, severely hungover or going through withdrawals or what have you, right? Physical, environmental, occupational, you get the picture. Addiction reaches into those areas and takes away. It's going to take away everything that the person had before and leave them a shell of a person. And a lot of people, when they come into a recovery center, the place they had been before was out on the streets, right? They had went from, in many cases, being what you might call a functional addict. They were able to work and hold down a job and, had a house and all that, to out on the streets, stealing, committing crimes, what have you, in order to feed the addiction, right? Because that's the thing. Everyone can manage their addiction until suddenly they can't. There's always going to be some sort of precipitating event, because life is full of those. It is full of these just unexpected setbacks. There's always going to be some sort of precipitating event that is going to push them from being functional to being out on the street, to being in full-blown addiction, to not being able to provide for themselves or contribute to society. And that's what addiction does. It tears the person apart. It turns them into the worst possible version of themselves, and that is what makes it such a challenge to treat, right? But there is hope, and I'm going to show these, and I want to say that faith as an aspect of recovery needs to be used in combination with, good social work, good medical care, good counseling, things like that. You need those other aspects to fit. But we cannot forget that spiritual component of the wellness circle, right? So let's look at some statistics, right? So higher spirituality is associated with lower, less frequent relapse risk during recovery. So what does that mean? It means that people who scored higher for spirituality, perhaps are attending church more, or they're believing really strongly in God's presence or things like that, they're less likely to relapse in their early days. And if they do relapse, it's going to happen less frequently, and typically they'll be more willing to try and stay in recovery. They have a relapse and they try and, work through it. Whereas people who don't have those things will often want to quit treatment immediately. Well, I've got my fix. I don't need all these rules at the treatment center, right? Involvement in a 12-step program, again, it's associated with lower and less frequent relapse risks during recovery. And a meta-analysis by High 2019 found that 12-step programs are highly effective for reducing relapse risk as well as for moving someone through the recovery process, right? So the meta-analysis examined something like 400 articles. So it was a pretty comprehensive study. It was not just a fly-by-night thing. Grimm and Grimm found that in more than 84% of scientific studies, faith was a positive factor in addiction prevention and recovery. It was seen as a risk in less than 2% of studies, right? So again, we're seeing that faith, the spiritual component of wellness, is a huge benefit, right? Whether it is in reducing relapse risk, whether it is guiding them through the recovery process, or whether it is being something that provides meaning, it's a huge benefit. Grimm and Grimm also found that faith reduced likelihood of initial drug use in the beginning, right? So in the first stage, it's going to reduce the risk that someone will ever use drugs and ever even get started on that path to addiction, right? And when we think about it, the reasons seem pretty straightforward, right? Faith typically touches on these four areas of wellness. Social, and we'll use a church for example, but you can think of any religious organization or religious service, right? Social. If you're going to church frequently, you're interacting with people, you're getting to know people, you're making connections, you're really feeding your social self, right? Emotional. Most Christian services are built on ideas of redemption and atonement and recovery and God's grace, right? Things that people who are in addiction typically don't get a lot of, right? These feelings that, you can be forgiven and you are good enough and there is someone that loves you, are feelings that many people in addiction do not have, right? We'll talk about spiritual last, but intellectual. And you might think, well, how can it do that? How can faith help with intellectual? Well, again, and this is just from the Christian perspective. I'm sure it's similar across different religions, right? Many people who are in addiction, not all, but many people who are in active addiction did not do super well in school. Like, that's just the truth, right? They were having horrible, horrible childhoods. They were getting into trouble, having just struggles you can't imagine, right? And many of them didn't do well in school. So if they're going to say a church and reading a Bible, that is intellectual stimulation that they've probably not had in a long time, right? I don't know if you've ever picked up a Bible, but it's a long, complicated book, and trying to read it is going to stretch your brain muscles. Whether you believe in it or not, different question, right? But just trying to read an old, difficult book, if you put time and effort into it, it is going to improve your intellectual capabilities, because there's lots of alternatives, but doing something like that is something that is a scholarly pursuit, right? Then finally, spiritual. This kind of goes without saying, but people in religious organizations, people who have faith in things, tend to have a sense of purpose and meaning in their life. For example, when they face a tragedy, many people will say, oh, well, it's God's will, the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away, or it's part of God's plan. I have to go through this so that I can be a better person in the future, or whatever. Those are things that a strong spiritual grounding, a sort of wisdom that that faith provides, that is hard to find elsewhere, right? So that's how faith connects to these 8 dimensions of wellness, and that's how individuals benefit from faith, at least physically, right? We're going to change gears a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about my work in recovery. I want to say thanks to the folks who were part of the book, got their names here. And what this was, it was a photo book that meant to tell artistically what the struggles of addiction were like, right? And kind of tell their stories and share their lives with people so that other people could know what they went through, how they struggled. And for those people who are in addiction or recovery, they could see that there is hope. There is a better life out there. It can happen to them if they want it. If you want recovery, it is there for you. The hand of God is always reaching out, right? You just got to take it. It started with concept art and then developed into photo shoots. You can see my drawings there. They're not nearly as good as my photography work. And then, we did the photo shoots, we did the editing, right? Really, again, trying to capture these feelings of addiction, right? We got Laura there. She found herself in drug-induced psychosis, and she described it almost like a demonic force having a hold of her. And that's what we tried to show here, this demonic force really just kind of grabbing her. That's the whole book. We're showing people's addiction, we're showing what it felt like in the visual form, and we're talking about their recovery. So that's my work. So for those of you working in schools, how can you help people with addiction or young people facing an addiction crisis? Well, one thing I recommend, and at our clinic we had this, we had an AA group that operated out of our clinic, is start an AA, NA, or Families Anonymous type group. It can be an official one, which is what I'd recommend. You find someone who's willing to sponsor and start the group, or it can be an unofficial one that basically plagiarizes their material, right? So what is it? It's a group meeting where you get all these young people in crisis together and you have a reading of some sort from, say, the AA book or the NA book. They talk about their experience. Everyone shares about their experiences, and it provides some positivity, some community, sense of meaning, right? That, because these young people going through crisis, they can be strong peer support for each other. Not like a licensed clinical peer support, obviously, but they know what the others are going through. They know what it's like to be a teenager living through these struggles, and they can help provide guidance to each other that a counselor or a teacher might not be able to, right? That they can give each other that kind of positive guidance and reinforcement that is missing in their life. And additionally, it will build a sense of community among them, right? Some of these kids who are going through these crises, they are probably looking for community. They're looking to be loved, and things like Al-Anon or Alateen or Nar-Anon or Naratine can really help them get that connection, right? Another thing that you can do, and obviously I know you got separation of church and state, and I know there are different regulations, but you could probably provide access to literature from different religious community groups. That's not saying actively push them in that way, but perhaps have some different flyers for, say, different churches or religious organizations that work with people who are, going through these types of crises, right? And if possible, again, this is going to depend on regulations and all that, perhaps you can work with these groups, right? Like, how great would it be to have events sponsored by, for example, say Hope City Church, right? They say, okay, we'll put together a trip for all the kids who are, in the Alateen or Naratine group. We'll put together a trip and take them rock climbing, and the bus takes them out there. They do an event. They get to meet with these church members, and then they come back to school, right? So it benefits them, helps them build that community, right? Because again, we go back to this wellness circle, right? It provides them the social, emotional, and perhaps intellectual kind of challenge that perhaps they've been missing, as well as can provide them the spiritual, right? Provide them that sense of meaning. It can tell them, like, hey, I know you're going through something hard now, but God has a plan for you, and you're going to, be able to do great things because you've suffered through this. You're going to be able to help so many people, and that's a message that many of these young people aren't getting, right? They go home, they're not getting the support they need, and then at school, they're not getting the support they need either. So that's my suggestion. I think it's a good one. I think it'll work, and I think it'll help. But whether or not your group or your organization can implement those things is a different question. So any questions for me, leave them down in the comments, post them below. Thank you so much. Y'all have a great day.